with the Planets, and I have Gianni from MMA Cycles. I think most people that follow financial astrology will know Gianni. Gianni being Italian, you can tell by his surname, and I actually am a resident of Italy and I've been living between London and Italy for the last couple of years and I have a lot of my interest there at the moment. And we were just sharing some messages on Twitter and we were talking about the election and we both thought she'd win actually. And we just sort of were like, oh, have you seen the Euro? What do you think of Italy? And I just put it out there that maybe we would do some astrology of Italy, maybe a little bit of astrology of the Euro, and I might even touch on the EU. And we just thought we might just have a bit of a conversation. It's totally ad hoc. We haven't really got too much. Gianni put one really interesting transit with me that lined up with some other stuff. So I was like, hey, let's maybe just make a little video. For those that don't know Gianni, he is with MMA Cycles, Ray Merriman, the kings, I guess, of financial astrology. I call it Ray Merriman, the financial astrologer's financial astrologer. I certainly started my journey through learning through MMA Cycles. They pull out a great weekly report every week for free, and they do really, really great paid reports on commodities and Bitcoin and ETFs and so on. I certainly started my journey learning off some of those. So anyone that does want to learn financial astrology, please follow the weekly for free. And if you get a bit stuck or want to learn some astrology or want to know the astrology, the weekly reports are the really professional sort of top-notch financial astrology. So Gianni, I'm going to let you start and maybe just sort of what you showed me and also looking at the election results and who's in power now, and then we'll sort of go a little bit from there, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate. I'm glad to be here. Just to give a little background, as Kate mentioned, I am Italian. I spent quite a bit of my life, mainly in the summers there. I am in the United States now. My parents moved here from Italy when I was just before I was born. So I do have my Italian citizenship as well. So most of my family's still there. My ear is very much to the ground. So this election was pretty big in terms of change in when it comes to Italians wanting something different. I can say spending a lot of time there that the EU, or more so the euro, hasn't really been the most prosperous monetary system for Italy. So let me go ahead and share my screen now. I have a few charts that I want to look at. We're going to start off by looking at Giorgia Meloni's chart. And let's go ahead and begin with the outer planets and see what kind of transits that Meloni was experiencing. So we'll begin with Saturn, and you'll see that Saturn is in around 19-20 degrees Aquarius now. So it's starting to move more so into the upper half of her chart. So Meloni's on the rise. And, it really was a monumental election for Italy because she's the first Italian leader, I think, ever that's a female. That's a pretty big step for Italy. You don't see that happen every day. So she has a coalition with Silvio Berlusconi, who was the prime minister for many years in the early 2000s, and Matteo Salvini, who is the leader of the League Party. So Salvini was in power for a little bit. They actually appointed Conte as the PM at the time, but Salvini was interior minister, and the big issue for them, aside from monetary matters, is immigration as well, because Italy had an agreement with Gaddafi in Libya for a long time, and that obviously fell apart when Gaddafi was overthrown in 2013. So Italy, basically being so close to Libya, is at the forefront of the immigration situation in Europe. And that was a big election issue. So when we see Saturn going in the upper half of her chart, as I said, she's on the rise. Another big transit, I think, for Meloni right now that she's experiencing is, Uranus opposite Uranus, and Uranus being in the sign of Taurus, no less, which rules currencies and monetary matters. That's where her midheaven is too. So that was a big campaign point that she shared with the electorate. And as Uranus goes over her Jupiter in time, I think some radical big changes with respect to monetary policy. She's going to be the one, I think, that implements them. Kate, I know that you have a trading background as well, but you look at like the credit default swaps that I think Credit Suisse actually has, for the risk of Italy going back to the lira. They've actually surged in value over the last couple of weeks here. So that's a big risk that financial markets are starting to price in. I talked about Saturn as well. We have the opposition. She just crossed that opposition with her natal Saturn and the ascendant as well. Pluto going through, her sun, right on her sun. So she is essentially could be the one that tears down the structures in Capricorn, and there's a new system coming after her. So that those are what I see with the outer planets. When it comes to Neptune, we're in that 20-degree area for Neptune, so not really hitting too many big spots. She has that square with her own natal Neptune, but not a lot of mutable in Meloni's chart. But one of the things I want to point out, I mentioned to you, Kate, before we began this discussion. So take a look at her ascendant and Saturn. It's at the 13 and 14 degree respectively of Leo. So when we talk about Italy, I think we have to talk about the Vatican as well, because, technically the Vatican's its own separate country. They had the Lateran Treaty that was established in the early 40s that made the Vatican its own city-state. So we're looking at a chart. Kate, do you see the chart of the Vatican here?
Yeah, got that.
Okay, so Meloni was born in Rome too. Vatican is basically a micro-state within the city of Rome. So Meloni's ascendant and her Saturn are right on the Vatican's Mars in Leo, 12th house. So you're going to see, it's really interesting when we look at even the Italian Republic chart of the 40s as well, the 1940s that is, a lot of similar planetary placements between the Vatican natal chart and the Italian Republic. But I think, with between Saturn and the ascendant on the Vatican's 12th house, Mars, if there are some governmental structural changes that take place in Italy, I think the Vatican might not be totally exempt from that. I also want to point out one slight thing too. I looked at this just before we got on this call, Kate, and it was, the Vatican's Uranus is at 10 degrees of Aries. And when Pope Francis was elected by the College of Cardinals in 2013, it was a Uranus return for the Vatican. So, many would say that Pope Francis has taken the church in a different direction, for better or for worse, depending on, your various viewpoints. But, when you look at the Vatican here, we have, Uranus obviously going to be going over the node and Jupiter as well. And we have, the Vatican was established at a new moon with a conjunction in Mercury as well. Mercury was retrograde, but those are the big things that I see there as well. So let me go ahead and pivot over to the, that's the Euro. I gotta stop sharing my screen here and share the Italy chart. Do you see the Italy chart now too, Kate?
Yes, that's popped up.
Okay, so the big thing here, I think the transit that has to be addressed immediately, we have June 10th, 1946, which also happens to be my birthday. So I have the same birthday as the Italian Republic, which I think is pretty auspicious, so to speak. But we have an ascendant 17 degrees of Scorpio, and opposite right now we have Uranus. So Uranus is coming up onto the upper half of the chart. So we're going to start, what is Uranus? Reforms, revolutions. We're in the sign of Taurus, monetary revolution. So I think that's the biggest transit that needs to be addressed on this chart. Scorpio rising, I think the way that the EU was established, there were some backdoor deals, no doubt, that were made. The Europeans never exactly voted to, join the Union. It was kind of an agreement set out by the, various PMs of different countries. But, eventually, Italy will have its Uranus return, because Italy, similar to the United States, has Uranus in the it's in Gemini, but actually it's 17 degrees. We were talking about the reunification chart of the 1860s, which I'll let you discuss, Kate. But Italy's Uranus in that chart, I think, is around 5 to 7 degrees of Gemini, if I'm not mistaken. But Uranus return coming up in this chart, it's in the 8th house. So I would think that as long as Meloni's in power, the risk of a new currency being implemented is higher with her, and it's basically going to be a reversion back to the lira. Because the Italians, they basically created the debt system and double entry accounting and all that kind of stuff. So if anyone knows how to game the monetary system, it was the Italians, so to speak. But look at here, that it's that Mars and Leo again. So between the Vatican and the the Republic of Italy foundation, Mars in Leo again there. So that seems to be a pretty important placement. And interestingly, that's also conjunct to Donald Trump's um, Mars. So I don't know how that fits in yet, but it is no doubt an interesting comparison, especially when you consider that Trump and Meloni are both Leo rising. So, similar populist energy expressed by those two. So, Kate, I'm going to let you take over and look at the
Oh,
Euro
I
chart
might
here.
just like to see one question. Whether Uranus returned for a country, how
Yeah,
would you describe that? Because I guess you've got a kind of revolutionary angle, but then I
yeah,
guess you've got sort of the shocks and the change. And so,
yeah.
because I've got some really interesting Uranus and Uranus Sun transits and stuff that all time around this sort of Uranus return. So, in case anyone's wondering what that might mean, like, so you can't. It's very hard to predict something like that, obviously. But do you think it's like a revolutionary kind of aspect, or?
Yeah, I mean, Uranus is the planet of revolution
Mm.
and chaos. So, Italy had a civil war at the same time as the United States did in the 1860s as well. So, when the peninsula was reunified, before that, it was a bunch of different city states. You had the Republic of Venice, you had the Kingdom of Naples, you had the Papal States, the Republic of Genoa, Republic of Florence and Venice, all different, city states on the peninsula. And then Victor Emmanuel, he's reunited the peninsula in the 1861. So yeah, I mean that was a revolutionary period, and it seems like Uranus going into Gemini is a hot spot, a hot transit for many countries, not just the
Mm.
United States and Italy. We've seen a lot of global conflagrations break out around that time. So
Mm.
we're around. I think we're at like 18 degrees of Taurus right now for Uranus. So it is coming. The ingress is around 2025, 2026. So 3 to 5
I
years
remember
away.
reading. I look. I don't. This is a really odd stat that in history there's never actually been Uranus in Gemini without a war. Now, a war doesn't have to be a war per se. War can be
Right.
things like. So it's quite interesting. There's a very geopolitical bit of history with Uranus going into Gemini. It's also a recession cycle as well, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, when you mentioned that, Kate, it makes me think, because NATO, the transatlantic military organization is pretty prominent in Italy. I mean, that's one of the major ways that Italy has its defense set up. And, the United States is basically the main backbone of NATO. So the reason I brought up Trump and Meloni and Mars, with the Mars and Leo and the ascendant, I think those are pretty big hotspots for that because for all intents and purposes, the U.S. is basically the defense system for Italy, and obviously Trump's not in power now. But if he were to get reelected again, and Meloni was in power in Italy at the same time, I think that would make for a very interesting dynamic. Now, not speculating that he would be reelected again necessarily. We're still quite a bit away from another election cycle, but it is interesting to see the similar placements in that Leo with Mars and the importance that NATO has for defense in the Italian peninsula, especially as you bring up the risk of war, because I don't think the risk of war in Italy is that high.
No,
Um,
and it could be just like a war with the EU in
yeah,
itself.
that's
It
what
doesn't have to be
I
a
mean.
physical war per
Yeah,
se. They can
yeah,
loggerheads, and I might even show something in the chart that shows that
yeah,
we're quite destined to get to this point. I think at some time. What I would just maybe mention, because someone did like comment on when I did like a little mini chart for the election. Someone said nothing ever sticks in Italy. Like all this stuff happens and it never
yeah,
sticks with the government. But it's probably
yeah,
worth mentioning that the eclipses that are coming in about 4 weeks. And they haven't made the election exactly official yet, have they? They've just sort of, they know she's the winner, but there's sort of another part, I think, where because where I'm going with that, any news around eclipse time tends to stick. So all the stuff that we're going to see coming in over the next 4 weeks and to do with her in Italy, they say with eclipses, news is final and it can't be reversed. So
yeah.
I think that's quite important because that would really not undo, but it would be quite a different situation going into that, around this eclipse time in 4 weeks and, both eclipses into November. So all the stuff we're going to see to do with the elections might actually stick this time.
Well, we just
It is
had that.
has happened in Mercury retrograde, obviously, which
Yeah.
and all these retrograde planets. But I'd be looking for news maybe around the next 4 weeks,
Yeah.
particularly around those eclipses.
Well, recall also, Kate, we had that Mars Uranus node conjunction in Taurus a few weeks ago, and that would have been right on the ascendant, opposite the ascendant of Italy as well. That was a couple weeks before the election.
Mm.
Now, the Manilius, who was a classical Hellenistic astrologer, attributed uh, Libra and Venus as the ruler of Italy. So when Meloni was elected, we actually had the new moon in Libra at the time.
And Pluto trine Venus.
Yes,
How,
yeah, and that was the
how cool was
aspect you
that? Yeah,
mentioned
there's a
for
perfect trine right at the time. And actually, I saw that and I was like, she's going to win just looking
yeah,
at that, like the
yeah,
trine that was going on.
yeah, and now we have Venus going into Libra today, on the 29th of September. So I do think it's going to stick.
Yeah, I
You
do
know,
too.
yeah, there's some speculation as whether the coalition's going to stand. But she actually came out today and said no, we're all on the same page. It's all good. And even there's been some claims that it's the government is much more radical than it really is. I mean, I think that's kind of relative. Even Matteo Renzi, who's kind of like Italy's Obama, I would liken him to, was on CNN and saying, it's not as like as right wing as some elements of the Western press are making it out to be. So Italy, they pay in a lot more to the EU than they get. The Italian pensioners have been suffering for a long time. There's not been much economic growth on the peninsula for well over a decade. So they're looking for a change,
Mm.
and we'll see whether it happens. You mentioned how Italy. It's kind of like the exception in this case would be if Italy actually keeps this government, because Italy has one of the most unstable governments in the
Yeah.
world. It's like they're calling for a new election. I think the average has been every 18 to 24 months. So it's a highly unstable government, and I think that probably has a lot to do with the ascendant being on Scorpio opposite Uranus. And Uranus in Gemini, that's a volatile placement as well. So yeah, that's kind of what I think.
Those angles that ascend and descend are being eclipsed as well, which brings a lot
Right.
of change onto itself. And the angles are actually more important than the planets, really. So I
Yeah,
think that's
exactly.
quite important too. So
Exactly. And in this case, the moon is itself in Scorpio. So, moon is basically the land, the
that's a good
homeland,
thing or a bad thing.
you know. So yeah, it's a time of change there. They're going
Yeah.
into the Uranus return in a couple of years too. So big things happening. You have the Venus Saturn conjunction in Cancer as well. Obviously, Saturn's not in his home in Cancer, and I think that speaks to the emotional instability of the government. It seems like and Italians can be dramatic people, right? So it's like every time the public mood changes, they want a new government.
Yeah.
And so, maybe it's time for them to reconstitute a new government. I don't know if that's going to get that dramatic, but I think in summary, before I pass the torch to you to look at the Euro chart and whatnot, I think the most likely outcome, if the reforms that Meloni wants actually go through, would be an exit from the euro monetary system. But I don't think that Italy would leave the common market. I think they would stay a part of the European.
Yeah, which was actually where I was going about. So, I thought maybe we'll share that we were having a bit of a conversation, I guess, which led into this. Do we think, and this is a little bit to do with a prediction from Jessica Adams, who's a good friend of
Yes.
mine and one of the best astrologers in the world. I've always been very mindful. She's been very adamant to me. Italy's gonna, she called it Quidily. They will leave, and I'm like, nonsense, nonsense, nonsense. My lawyer in Italy, she's like, it's never happening, and she's a massive human rights lawyer all over the world, Northern Ireland, everything. Well, this kind of, and it's interesting because the EU are barking a little bit at the moment and having a little bit of a threat, and
Right.
so it's interesting. And so we just did start this sort of just a little 2-3 words on where we got today. Do you think they'll leave the EU? And let's just say, I think we're both pushing to looking at the euro as well and looking
Right.
at the it's certainly possible. I don't think it's a write-off. So let's have a look at the chart, and this is a chart where we sort of that I want to say that you sort of brought this up to me. I'm just going to bring the chart in. So this is a chart, actually a completely different one that you were using. And you did point out to me this Uranus return, and this is where I started and I had actually started doing my forecast for next year, Mercury retrograde, and I ended down this rabbit hole of the euro into this sort of time period where I'm going to, rather than do it for a 2023 forecast at the end of the decade, we might discuss it today, because this chart brings your euro in quite a lot closer than at that sort of 15 degrees. And
Right.
I presume this is what you're looking at, that you're going to start to get Uranus coming down, making this revolutionary, conjunctions when the two planets are on top of each other. So you're
Right.
starting about 2027 here. And then Uranus is, for those that don't quite know in astrology, is going to what we call station, go back and forth. And that's actually where the biggest juice of astrology happens, when a planet stops and goes back. I call it the grind, when it goes back over, because that's where you really start to see a lot of the news, when you start to see particularly the big outer planets making, going on top of each other and making these conjunctions. So I would think using this chart. Now it's interesting because Pluto is also at 7 degrees as well, and the degree is really important. So it's going to pick up both this Pluto and both this Uranus here. Because any of these outer, and then you've got, look at here, Pluto at 6 degrees, which means it's around 7 degrees as well.
Yeah.
So you've got a lot of this Pluto Uranus stuff going on, and you've actually got Uranus square Saturn here and stuff too. So if this is your sort of revolutionary aspect, it's quite interesting. Now, there is a lot of really interesting Euro and EU astrology coming. I might actually just quickly, because thinking of this Uranus Pluto, I might actually share a chart of, here we go, the Euro and Italy together. Now, the EU and the Euro share the same charts. They're 1 month apart. So it could even be the EU. So you can even pretend this is an EU chart. Not much is going to change. So look at that. So all this Uranus Pluto activity that's going on, and what gets quite interesting, I guess we'll get really trendy here. We could use 3 charts. So when we have this opposition in 2027, Uranus will oppose the Pluto of the EU as it, makes the conjunction. And then you're also going to have, so you've got this Uranus Pluto, and that's a little explosive, would you say? Maybe.
Yeah. If it even makes it that long, I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I mean is, like, I think the EU strategy, if they do want to keep Italy within the euro, would be, to delay and just wait for the public mood of Italy to change again, and rely on another election so that Meloni wouldn't be in power anymore. But yeah, I mean, Uranus is shock, obviously, and Pluto rules debt, and we know that debt basically is the underpinning of the currencies. And the European Central Bank just lifted off of zero. They were in negative interest rates. They were at zero, at or below zero for over a decade. So I don't know if Uranus going over in that opposition with Pluto is kind of like they're trapped into an inflationary cycle. They have to raise rates, and that kind of just destroys the bond market, and that leads to the end of the currency system. I think, when we talk about the big changes, I don't think that the EU as an economic entity is necessarily going to win. I do think the risk is in the monetary system. So, I want to be clear on that. That's the issue. They all have different fiscal needs and fiscal budgets, and they're trying to apply a one-size-fits-all monetary system to countries with vastly different fiscal needs. And I think that's what creates the disconnect between those, the various nations.
And so I guess the biggest sort of other question that goes all this hanging over, the fate of the euro.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure on it. What about you?
Well, I mean,
As it is right now, let's put it that. I don't know, like something looks up.
Well, I mean, I guess the question would be, this isn't like Brexit in the sense, with the risk of Italy leaving. You always had the British pound.
This would be more of a probably going with other countries, or
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I mean, I have to be psychic, I guess, a little bit to. It'd take you about a year's worth of astrology, to actually come up with. So it's not so. This is also not supposed to be a scare tactic, but we all want to plan our lives and know what to do with assets and stuff. So the more we can look into this sort of astrology crystal ball, the better. to try and get a bit of a gauge what's going on.
Well,
So what?
I think you want the dollars and Swiss francs. I mean, if you want the currency, I mean, if Italy were to leave the euro, it's the third biggest economy in the European Union. So you know, again, the UK was never part of the euro monetary system. So if you lose your third biggest economy, then you're not going to have as much GDP.
Well, things are Hungary along the way. I am Hungarian descent, just putting it out there. So I feel like I've got a lifeline with this election.
I think if Italy were to leave the euro,
all sorts of things could happen along the way.
Yeah, I think they would just go back to the lira. I don't think they would join anyone else in a monetary union. I think they want the lira so that they can control their own monetary policy.
I had an image of all these old Italian guys with the lira still under the bed, actually.
Oh, I know,
just saving, and pulling it out, because that's how they work there. And it's really interesting. You know, the Bitcoin conversation was interesting. Everyone's like, the world will be Bitcoin. I was like, I can't even buy bread with an ATM card in Italy. It's very old school, and I don't live in the most remote village known to, so they really do have the chances of Bitcoin, and yes, in the modern day in Milan and all that stuff, but the chances of this digital currency is going to freak everyone out. And the old school Italians,
they'll never do it. They won't do it.
Mm-hmm. They won't do it. They are so stuck in their ways, which as tradition is fantastic and actually was a big draw card, but they're not going to be paying for bread and milk with Bitcoin. It's or crypto or like a digital euro or anything. They just will not budge, So that's just sort of interesting. Okay, so what I wanted to show with the euro. Do you remember I guess it was like the 2010 to 2012 to 2014, we had that big euro problem.
Yeah, with Greece and the debts and all that. Yeah.
I just really want to quickly show the astrology going back there, because it's really obvious what was going on, because we have Pluto coming down over the sun. Pluto, sun, the sun is always the entity in a chart, so that is the physical euro. Now Pluto can be a bit of a big drama, it can be someone asserting their power, but this was like smack bang on. And of course, what we're saying with Uranus when it does the grind, as I call it. So you have Pluto going back and forwards over the sun all this way into, and sort of left in 2014, actually when that crisis kind of finished, So that's quite interesting. So I actually have found some astrology that does replicate this a little bit. And, really pulling, I guess, into your Italy timing of this Uranus to return around 2027. It's quite interesting. So what we can do, and I don't want to make it too complicated, we can run like a second chart. Okay, we put here, we've got this sun here going into 4 degrees of Aquarius. And what we've then got, because we've got Pluto going to 0 Aquarius next year, so that means Pluto at some point is going to come over the solar arc sun, and that's going to kind of be around, let's see, it goes backwards and forwards from memory, sort of about 2029, 2030, and the EU actually has a fairly similar chart as well. But what gets really interesting, so I really think, and actually I'll go back a little bit, because sort of around this sort of, might be a different chart, I'm doing this all on the fly, but I really feel like Pluto coming down. Look, you've even got Uranus here at 9 degrees as well, and this sun at 9 degrees. I remember that Pluto opposition to Pluto was around that 9 degrees stuff as well.
Right.
And I'll also show the Italy chart, because this is quite, I think it was this, I'm doing this all on the fly a little bit from memory. I might just pause this for 2 secs, hang on. This time, because everyone says I get made very confusing, like lots of charts, so I actually wrote it out for once and tried to make it a little bit more user-friendly. So for me, everything's coming in 2027 to 2029. Now it's really interesting because that's when your Uranus return starts. So what's going to happen is the Uranus opposite Pluto that I showed before, and we're going to have in the Euro and the EU Jupiter square Pluto September 2027, very close to your Uranus return. Jupiter-Pluto is a pretty big money transit. 2009 we had the Jupiter-Pluto just in the sky and it all kind of fell apart. And, there does seem to be a lot of money kind of stuff when we have Jupiter square Pluto in charts. We do see a bit of a fallout. Now we're also going to have the Saturn return of the EU and the Euro in 2027. I'm just going to point out the Saturn is being eclipsed when Pluto goes to Aquarius next year at 29 degrees of Aries. If I can quickly show you that chart here. So you're going to get this eclipse coming in May 2023. So that can usually, and I'm pretty rare to find a Saturn eclipse that's quite fun. So I think we may see a little bit of activity around the Euro and maybe all the EU coming into that early part of the year. Okay. Then in 2028, Pluto is going to oppose Uranus. Now that's probably going to be some kind of shock. We may start to see the news coming out about all this stuff then. And that's also going to be that Pluto-Uranus opposition. And then this solar eclipse is going to go opposite the sun of the Euro. Now, when we have an eclipse opposite the sun, that can be a little bit bearish, or we see often a lot of news that can be a little bit negative. So that we've got all these, and this is huge transits all coming into one. And then we're going to have Saturn square Uranus, Neptune square the sun, Uranus semi-square Saturn. Then there's a really, really important transit coming March 2029. And for me, if you put a gun to my head and said, what's happening to the Euro? I'd be like 2029. Okay, because that is, and that, you know, looking back at that other transit before when we had that financial crisis, well, what's going to happen around 2029 is that this North Node is going to come over the sun here. And again, we look back in history to see what happened the last time the node was at, and the node is where the eclipses are, just in case anyone doesn't understand that, in charts when the asset was born or whatever, or where the eclipses are going to be. And the last time that this North Node was at 10 Capricorn was at that financial crisis. So we are going to repeat the same astrology here in 2029. It's pretty big. So I really, now it might not be that the Euro goes, but it's likely going to be in the headlines. There's going to be something quite big. So we have that transit I just showed, Pluto and the sun, which is again the same thing that happened around that Greek bailout. And then what's going to happen 2030, and I really feel like the bulk of this stuff is going to happen 2029, 2030, because this is what's called a progressed chart when we look at what's going on in time. And we can see the sun is coming along to Uranus here. But if I move it around to this kind of, sorry, I've got months, that's why it's not moving, 2029, 2030, well, what's happening? Sun, progressed sun conjunct Uranus. Uranus will take over the sun. So that it's a pretty monster transit, you know, and it would be probably, I imagine, I don't know, you work with Ray, you know, around this 2030 they come together and Uranus takes over. You know, that's what they say a lot in these progressed charts with some of the predictive books, that the planet that conjuncts the sun takes over the sun. So it looks like massive change on some level here. And there's actually a double Uranus sun aspect that's coming. So for me, you know, 2030, 2029, 2030, and we, you know, we have all this Saturn opposite Pluto, Uranus squared Jupiter. Saturn is going to, you know, come on the solar arc descendant, and the angles are very important, something to do with other people. Okay, so that is for me where I think we may see, if the Euro is going to, I'm not saying it will, but I think there'll be major change, because that's the EU chart as well. Anything that happens to the EU happens to the Euro, that'll have that Uranus sun. So I really feel they may not be around at that point. If I really had to go, look, I don't know, but if we do start to see, we would always see the news way beforehand anyway, okay? But I will point out the Euro solar arc sun will move to 0 Aquarius July 2024. Well, what's happening? Pluto is going to 0 Aquarius, and that's when Pluto goes over the sun. So 2024, we're probably going to see something because Pluto going to 0 Aquarius is so massive, and Uranus is at 0 degrees too. And then you're going to have, you know, the solar arc sun is also going to be around solar arc Uranus. as well in 2023. So what I would say, whatever you see going on in this sort of 2023, probably more in 2024, will probably give a bit of a clue, because astrology leaves us clues. And then we're going to have obviously that eclipse, that 29-degree Pluto square, and Pluto will square that eclipse anyway, so it's going to be a bit of a mess globally. I don't think things will look that great in April 2023, just generally heads up. And the euro may get involved in the story, or the EU will be involved in the story some way. And then in October 2023, the solar eclipse at 21 Libra will conjunct the progressed descendant. So we'll probably see a bit of change. We may see some change, or the change of identity. And there's a few other pretty heavy transits and stuff too. Now, Italy really popped up to me, same time frame as you, 27, 28, 29. Uranus, that's going to be doing your conjunction, and it does that Uranus opposite Pluto. And Saturn will conjunct Uranus and oppose Pluto 2030. The most important transit, and I might actually just bring this up quickly on the Italy chart, it might be a bit different to yours, and I'd be interested what you think actually with this, is that, the sun here at 29 degrees of Aquarius, well, we're going to have an eclipse pretty close to that, and that eclipse is going to be in 2026, and that eclipse will fall over the sun. And generally when an eclipse falls on the sun, it actually can give us power. So anyone that's Italian watching this, that thinks this is all sounding a bit scary, well, not necessarily, because we also, things change. You usually see a major lot of change, but eclipse. So sometimes you see a complete change, or you get a bit of power. So anyone that is Italian watching this, have a look to 2026, which is a year before that, and the eclipse can take a year to show up, which comes into your Uranus return of the revolution.
I want to mention one more thing, Kate. You're highlighting the sign of Aquarius. If you look back at the conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn that unfolded at 0 degrees Aquarius, I believe it was in it was December of 2020 or 2021. In any event, that was the first time that we had that conjunction. We call it the Great Chronocrater between Jupiter and Saturn in an air sign since the 1300s, which was when that preceded the Renaissance in Italy. So I do think that there is, there has to be some, perhaps some pain in the short term, but I do think that once the dust settles, that some of the greatest investment opportunities will actually be in Europe, because European equity markets have really not done well in the last decade and a half or so. But once I think they sort this out with, when it comes to the monetary system and all that, I do think there will be a lot of opportunities to make money in the Eurozone. So, but as you talk about the sign of Aquarius, I think it's important that we also, highlight that conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn that recently took place, because it represented a shift in that, basically that great chronocrater cycle.
And it's interesting because, watching the EU have something to say to Italy, you can see that their Pluto was eclipsed at that 10-degree Taurus.
Yeah.
So, that's the EU coming down, trying to tell them what to do, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's why we're seeing a lot of this news now. And look, it may even be that eclipse at 29 degrees of Aries, because with a 29-degree sun,
Right.
And that's called a critical degree, so you may even, again, there sort of feels like there could be some news that comes out, so, and look, where I live, the housing market is strong. All the Americans have come in. I live in Tuscany. They've just bought up everything. So, but that's not necessarily the case everywhere. And this low American dollar, this high American dollar, low euro, you may really see a fair bit of investment at the moment, so I don't think it's necessarily a doom and gloom. Well, but I just think things may change.
Yeah. Well, you raise a really good point, Kate, because, where most of my friends and family we're in southern Lazio. But I remember in the 90s, it was really common. They had the big devaluation of the lira. You had a lot of Italians borrowing. They were taking mortgages out in lira, and they were, living and working in the UK or in France or in the States, building these immaculate houses, and the currency was depreciating on their mortgage. So they were paying it back in their home currency, converting with cheaper and cheaper it cost them less because they made money in the foreign currency that was appreciating against the lira, and instead they were able to afford much nicer homes. So to your
Well, there
point,
is a negative side of that. That it's a.
yeah,
I know there's a problem for Italians if the Americans come and that they actually are paying too much where I live, and so it's really outpricing a
yeah.
lot of the locals and stuff like that. But you probably will see a generation because Italians don't tend to sell their
No, I was
places.
just gonna say a lot of time
Yeah, they
they
just
hoard the
sit
property.
empty.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, they do.
quite a different sort of culture, You may
Right.
see some of the younger generation, because some people want to leave Italy, that's like a reality thing. You may see.
Yeah,
So I think there's a blessing and a curse with the American dollar to the euro and stuff like that.
yeah,
I haven't really done I'm not saying the euro is going to go down the whole way kind of thing to that. I haven't really looked at it that much. So, the whole point of this, I think, long term projection, things will look pretty different. And as I said, if I had to bring a year, I'd say be looking 2029, 2030, even
yeah.
maybe. So I think end of the decade, just don't know if I see it the way it is. Could be wrong, but it'll be massively in the headlines, or there'll be something really different. So I think things just look poised for change, I guess, a little.
Yeah, well, one more thing from a mundane standpoint, Kate, is next year in 2023, we have three outer planets changing signs in 3 months. We have Saturn going into Pisces in
Crazy.
March. We have Jupiter going um, into Taurus in May, and Pluto goes into Aquarius. I think is it March or May?
It's about May because it's exactly, well, it
Yeah,
might be a
May.
bit before, but right when that solar eclipse happens at
Yeah,
29 and a half Aries, which is almost like technically 0 degrees.
yeah.
So that eclipse that is square Pluto and Pluto going to Aquarius at the same time. Oof. I think I might stay home for that one.
That's
Just
not
to
going to
think.
be where's Jupiter going to be during that eclipse, Kate? Because that's going to be
Let's quickly open that up.
because Jupiter's going into Taurus in May, and when is that eclipse in May?
No, I think it's a little bit separate. Jupiter and Taurus has some odd stats. I'm going to do that a little bit separately. I'm not going to bring that in here. I think we'll be very careful not to think everything's amazing because Jupiter's going into Taurus, because it has some very odd stats. I
Yeah,
think you get about 8-9 degrees, and then it starts
yeah.
to go a bit. And I think that Jupiter Uranus conjunction will be doing its own thing at 21 degrees.
And that's a T square. Oh, that's with Earth. Never mind.
One of those, interestingly, the tsunami happened in a couple of months after that. You had Uranus at 29 degrees Pisces, and Jupiter expands what it touches. So,
Yeah.
it's cool when it's there, but when it's over, we won't do that now. That's a whole other thing.
Okay.
So you've got Jupiter here. Look, for me, it's too far away from the eclipse to
Yeah.
be considered conjunct at six
Yeah.
degrees away. So I don't, and the fact that Pluto is squaring this eclipse, I just don't think it's a matter of, there's Jupiter there, because it's like, that's the Verta, this thing, the VX, don't worry about that, anyone that's saying the big red triangle. So I think we need to just get through. But again, this may pick up that chart of Italy, because you've got that 29 degrees, and the degree, and you can even have one on either side. It doesn't even have to be touching. And interesting, it falls on Italy's Mars. So you may
Yeah.
see a little bit of, but the point is 2026, have a bit of a look, which is, into that 2027, the revolution. I think that
Yeah.
really sticks out. And it could be a really interesting and exciting time for Italy, I think,
Yeah.
and of course, economically, we will be coming out of deflation. I think we'll be right in peak deflation, so be quite interesting, I think, to see
Yeah.
what's going on. So that's just, but there's certainly look. All the signs are pointing to something, I think, here. So you have to make your own decisions with the euro. But I think, the key with the euro, just watch the news on the way, because astrology leaves us clues. As I like to call it, Cluedo. Watch for the clues. We always want a real world example to add to the astrology. Otherwise, it's just all
Yeah.
in it. But so when we do start to get stuff, so we'll see if Jessica Adams, I'll probably do something with her along the way, and I'm sure she'll bring that out. But she may have just been onto something. Quiddly, I don't
One
know,
last transit as I look at this chart, Kate, before we wrap it up.
Yeah.
When we have Pluto ingress into Aquarius, it's going to be square the Pluto in the 1861 chart, the natal of Pluto in Taurus, which is money.
Ah.
So Pluto is debt, Taurus is money. we're entering that period where, if the the new government in Italy can make it, past 18 months, then I think,
Well,
we
they
might
will
actually
if it's
start to
around the
see
eclipse.
some,
Yeah.
yeah,
And look, I don't think it's I look at the just short term. I think it's probably a good thing to from where we were like six. And everyone will have different thoughts on this. So I don't want to get too political and stuff, but certainly short term, the different views on some of the things like the green passports and all that kind of stuff. I
yeah,
think that'll provide a little bit of relief. Maybe Pluto Zero Aquarius will, tie into this COVID a little bit and stuff as well. So,
yeah.
it's a bit of softer energy is not the worst thing around that. Because I was in the lockdown in Italy, not the really, really crazy one. I was in Larancha, which is orange. So it wasn't too bad, but that was enough for me. So, yeah, so that's just a little bit on some Gianni, I guess, being Italian, and me having, some of our thoughts about it. And if anyone is thinking of moving to Italy, investing in Europe or the euro, or maybe hopefully this helps you a little bit. But I think the takeaway message is maybe don't expect the status quo to be the same, would you say,
Right.
maybe?
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure.
Yeah, so yeah, hopefully that's of interest to someone. And thank you for watching. And MMA Cycles are the best in the biz of financial astrology. So please, especially if you want to learn or you're interested, make sure to check out their weekly free, or if you're a little bit stuck in something, they might be able to give you a little bit of light down the passage to how we can get out. So I wish you all the best and into 2023 and beyond. Thanks for watching.
Grazie, alla prossima.
Ooh, thank you so much. Ciao. Arrivederci.